What is going on? Welcome to the episode. Today we are talking about all things carnivore diet because I recently experimented with it, and so we are going to cover some of the pros, the cons, who it may work well for, who it may not be for, my personal experience with it, whether I am going to continue following it or not, and a whole bunch more. First of all, what is it? The carnivore diet consists of solely animal foods, so meat, poultry, fish, seafood, eggs, and dairy. Sounds kind of wild, right? Why would anyone be crazy enough to just eat animal foods? Well, it turns out that the carnivore diet can be a really powerful therapeutic tool for a whole host of health issues. For example, this diet really shines in terms of putting autoimmune disease into remission. And so that would include things like MS, lupus, Crohn's, ulcerative colitis, inflammatory bowel disease, rheumatoid arthritis, psoriasis, all sorts of things. A lot of people have also reported resolving things like bipolar, schizophrenia, severe depression and anxiety, OCD, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, and the list goes on. Also, tons of folks have lost a lot of weight and reversed insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. I listened to an interview recently where a woman lost 500 pounds on this diet. Now, to be fair, she started at 800 pounds, but regardless, that is absolutely incredible. Personally, I do not see carnivore as being a quote-unquote fad diet. It just keeps gaining in popularity, and I genuinely believe that this is going to be one of, if not the most powerful tool for autoimmune disease and digestive disorders, period. That's a big statement, which leads us into the how does it work part. Like, how is eating just animal foods and eliminating plants of all things having such a powerful effect on the body? There are two key factors at play. One is what we eat, and the other is what we don't eat. Let's double click on both. The carnivore diet contains essentially zero ultra-processed foods because if you think about it, what ultra-processed food contains just animal ingredients? None. And eliminating ultra-processed food is an absolute game changer for our health. On the other end of the spectrum, if someone is following a vegan diet, let's say, there are tens of thousands of ultra-processed foods that still fall under the vegan umbrella. Oreos are vegan. The same goes for the paleo diet, the ketogenic diet, or something like Weight Watchers. All of these other approaches have ultra-processed food options that you technically can eat and still stay, quote-unquote, on the diet. That doesn't apply to carnivore, which is a massive advantage. Now, when we eliminate ultra-processed foods, we eliminate all sorts of inflammatory and immunogenic foods that irritate the immune system and wreak havoc in our bodies. The kicker is that some people have immune reactions, not just to ultra-processed foods, but also even with certain single-ingredient whole plant foods. For example, some folks don't do well with gluten. Specifically people with celiac disease and gluten sensitivity. It makes them very sick. Some people can't tolerate nightshades like tomatoes and potatoes. They may flare up their skin, their joints, or something else. Interestingly enough, my mom recently overdid the tomatoes because she had a bunch growing in her backyard and it really flared up her eczema. Certain individuals are sensitive to oxalates that are incredibly high in foods like spinach and almonds. Others don't do well with FODMAPs, which are specific fermentable carbohydrates like broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, and Brussels sprouts, among many others. Point being, plants are not benign. They have been around a lot longer than we have, and while they don't run, fly away, or bite back like an animal in order to defend themselves, they use chemical means to survive. Because just like a lioness does everything that it can to protect its cubs from hyenas, plants do everything that they can to protect their babies, aka their seeds, from predators too. The tricky thing is that plants use more of a passive approach versus an aggressive or assertive approach. For example, think back to high school. If two dudes have a problem with one another, they usually just fight and somebody wins, and that's that. But teenage girls tend to use different tactics. They may spread a really nasty rumor about someone and use a much more mental or emotionally based scheme to cause damage. This is kind of how plants do their thing. They use a more passive-aggressive approach, i.e. chemical means to protect themselves and propagate their species, whereas a lion uses a very outright aggressive tactic, i.e. physicality, to protect themselves and propagate their species. And so this is why animal foods are so quote-unquote safe for humans once they are dead. It's no longer a threat to us because its defenses have been defeated. However, that is not the case in the plant world. Just because you pick some spinach off the vine doesn't mean that it's safe to consume in large quantities. That would be too easy, right? If you could just walk up to any plant that is rooted in the ground and eat as much of it as you wanted without any negative consequences, we wouldn't have plants because they'd all be extinct. It's worth noting that we can lessen the chemical burden of certain plants via things like soaking, cooking, sprouting, fermenting, etc. However, many plants are still quite resistant to varying processing methods. Fruit specifically is a bit of an in-betweener because fruit wants you to eat it and then distribute its seeds either directly or via the elimination process. For example, a papaya. You open it up, scrape out the seeds, and eat the delicious, meaty flesh. This would be an example of directly spreading seeds. On the other hand, something like a kiwi, where the seeds are embedded in the flesh of the fruit, you eat it all and then distribute the seeds via bowel movement elimination. Plants cannot get up and walk, and so they require us and other animals to transport their seeds. Also, fruit does not want you to eat it when it's unripe, and that's why unripe fruit doesn't taste very good. For example, a green banana. No, thank you. But a perfectly bright yellow one? Yes, please. The reason that fruit doesn't want you to eat it when it's unripe is because its seeds aren't ready yet. It takes 9 months to grow a little human babe, and it takes time for fruit to mature its seeds too. In fact, if you eat unripe fruit, it's probably going to give you a stomachache. And that's just another way that fruit deters you from eating it until it's ready. For example, I've eaten a banana that wasn't quite ripe yet, and my stomach didn't like it. Also, it's fascinating because unripe bananas are even harder to open, i.e. peel, whereas a very ripe one is essentially peeling itself because the skin is splitting. Plants know what they're doing. Having said all of that, some folks seem to be able to eat all the vegetables, nuts, grains, and seeds as they want and maintain great health. That is awesome, and if you're one of those folks, just keep doing what you're doing. However, not everyone is so fortunate, And so some people need to be more aware of the plant foods that they ingest. Okay, so that's the what we don't eat part. The other factor is what we do eat, because you got to eat something, right? Otherwise, you starve. And it turns out that animal foods are the most nutritious and nutrient-dense foods on the planet. I used to believe that you absolutely had to eat vegetables in order to be healthy. And it turns out that there are plenty of folks that have just been eating animal foods for decades, and they are thriving. Years ago, when I came across these people, I thought to myself, there's no way. Zero fruit, zero veg. What about vitamin C? What about antioxidants, phytonutrients, fiber, and this and that? And the more that I dug into this stuff, the quicker that I realized that, wow, animal foods are even healthier, more nutrient dense, and more bioavailable than I thought that they were. Now, make no mistake, humans are in fact omnivores, meaning we've evolved to consume animals and plants. However, one of the most interesting things that we see practically in the real world is that folks run into issues on a vegan diet if they don't supplement certain nutrients, B12 being the most common. However, we don't seem to see the same issues in carnivores. Even nutrients like vitamin C. I still haven't come across someone following the carnivore diet that has developed scurvy. Now, maybe it'll happen at some point, and just because someone hasn't developed full-blown scurvy doesn't mean that their vitamin C levels are necessarily optimal, let's say. But either way, there are no documented cases as far as I'm aware right now. Fun fact, back in the day when they were assessing whether meat had vitamin C in it or not, they actually just assumed that it had none, and so they didn't bother to check. Not very scientific. It turns out that fresh meat does have vitamin C in it. Also, a gentleman named Stefan Van Vliet is doing amazing research at Utah State University, and he's discovered that beef, for example, actually contains phytonutrients. Phyto meaning plant, and nutrients meaning nutrients, of course. Because these ruminant animals, like cows, are consuming grasses, and in turn, the phytonutrients from the grasses are actually in the meat itself. How cool is that? Beef is not just protein, fat, and a few vitamins and minerals. It is now believed to have over 40,000 different compounds in it. This stuff is just so exciting, and it tosses the whole plant-based or lab-grown meat idea completely out the window, because how are you going to mimic 40,000 plus unique compounds, most of which we don't even know what they are or what they are doing in the body? We often think that we're smarter than Mother Nature. Like, can't make it outside? No problem. Just swallow a bunch of vitamin D. Same thing. Don't want to change your eating habits and lose fat? Take an Ozempic shot. No big deal. Having trouble sleeping? Don't modify your behavior. Just take an Ambien or chug some NyQuil. Headache? Here's some Tylenol. Now, don't get me wrong. Some of these things can be amazing tools in certain situations. For example, if someone breaks their leg and they're in so much pain that they can't sleep, pain meds could be a temporary godsend. But this stuff isn't designed to be taken consistently long-term as if it's a solution. It's meant to bridge a gap. Now, I do really feel for people because so many folks just aren't aware of how what they are putting in their mouths is actually causing so many of their ailments. For example, I was just talking to a buddy yesterday, and he showed me some psoriasis that he was experiencing on his legs. And he was telling me about how he was using all sorts of creams, and it just wouldn't go away. Now, psoriasis, like most other skin conditions, is caused by what you eat. and therefore it is very much fixable via modifying your nutrition. But we're not taught this stuff. We're taught that, hey man, luck of the draw, you pulled the short straw, sorry, you just need this corticosteroid cream for the rest of your life. It is what it is, it's genetics. That to me is not acceptable, as well as not true. And in regards to the skin specifically, I had eczema for years, and I completely cleared it up via changing my diet. Side note, if you have a skin thing going on, listen to episode 285 titled What to Eat and Not Eat for Clear Skin. Now, maybe you don't have any skin issues, but you do have tension headaches all the time, or acid reflux, or joint pain, or IBS, or bloating, issues with going to the bathroom, or you're getting sick all the time. The body is designed to thrive. It wants nothing more than for you to feel, look, and perform your best. Because we, just like other animals and plants, are made to propagate our species. And if we are unhealthy, that is far less likely. And evolution doesn't want that. All right, with that backdrop, let's get into my personal experience with the carnivore diet. Really quick health summary here just to provide a bit of context. I used to be a chubster. I was clinically obese, so I had way too much body fat, eczema, arthritic joint pain, depression, anxiety, you name it. And then I lost 60 pounds. I cleared up my eczema and rid myself of the depression and angst via going from eating like a child to eating like an actual adult. And it's worth mentioning that I also reduced my alcohol intake drastically, which made a huge difference. This was all amazing for my physical, mental, and emotional well-being. However, while my arthritic joint pain, which I experienced most prominently in my knees, did improve via a general healthier eating approach, it still bugged me a lot. I motored along and managed okay for years. I didn't let the pain hold me back from staying active, but the discomfort was absolutely there. And enter the carnivore diet. I first became aware of this eating approach about 7-ish years ago, and I actually did a podcast episode on it way back when. Also, I gave this diet a college try, we'll say, about 2.5 years back, but I wasn't 100% adherent for more than a week at a time, and so I wanted to really dial things in and see if being 100% on point for longer would completely clear up my knees, because for tons of people, it has. And so, I originally committed to 30 days, and it was looking really promising. My knees were feeling better, my energy was incredible, my digestion was literally perfect, I had zero bloat, I was going to the bathroom daily, and hands down, it's been the best digestion I have ever had in my life, without a doubt. Which you may be pretty surprised to hear without veggies or fruit in the mix. My skin improved, and I've been happy with my skin for ages now, but I saw noticeable improvements. My sleep was on point. I was finding myself sleeping for less time, but the quality was so good that I felt even more rested. My mental clarity and productivity work-wise was off the charts. I was rolling. My physical performance in terms of resistance training was a tad bit flat, but it was nothing to write home about. My running performance started out really well. However, I did notice that on my last 2 runs while doing the diet, my quads were cramping a fair bit, and I was a lot more sore the day of and the day after. But to be fair, this was almost certainly an electrolyte issue and not necessarily due to the diet in and of itself, per se, because the carnivore diet contains either no carbohydrates or trace amounts from things like dairy. And carbohydrates produce insulin, which is not evil like some folks may tell you just don't want it to get out of control. And insulin helps to regulate electrolyte status. And so, because I was consuming basically zero carbohydrates, my body required a lot more sodium. And so that was likely the cause of the cramping and recovery issues. So for the first 2.5 weeks of doing this diet, it was great. And then things took a bit of a turn. My knee pain actually began to resurface, and that's when I realized that I was experiencing something called oxalate dumping. Now, I originally became aware of oxalates back in 2020-ish, and I went down the rabbit hole. I learned that they are tied to a whole bunch of health issues, and joint pain is one of the biggies. And so I did all the hours of research. I brought an oxalate expert on the pod named Sally Norton. That's episode 172 if you're interested. And I began to put some of this stuff into practice. What are oxalates? Oxalates are compounds or chemicals found in plants that most commonly lead to kidney stones. This is why when someone has a kidney stone, they're put on a low oxalate diet, and so they're encouraged to avoid things like spinach, almonds, and rhubarb, to name a few. Oh, and if you experience frequent UTI-like symptoms, but when you get tested, you don't actually have a UTI, it very well might be an oxalate issue. But back to the spinach, almonds, and rhubarb. Those are healthy foods though, right? Well, in small quantities, they can almost certainly be consumed by most folks without issues. However, there are people that are putting cups of spinach in their smoothies or scrambled eggs every single day, and or eating almond butter on their toast every morning like it's going out of style. They're also often consuming tons of other ultra-processed oxalate-laden foods. My hand is up. Guilty as charged. I didn't become obese back in the day by eating quote-unquote clean or healthfully. I was eating a ton of ultra-processed food. I remember so many times just shoving handful after handful of peanut M&Ms in my mouth on a quote-unquote cheat day that I felt as though I earned because, nothing says congrats for staying on track like going off track. And the kicker is that peanuts and chocolate are both wildly high in oxalates. And we haven't evolved to eat this many oxalates because we simply wouldn't have had access to high oxalate foods like this on a daily basis or even at all in some circumstances. For example, back in the day, we may have eaten some spinach for 2 weeks out of the year when it was in season, but not twice per day for 2 decades. And so the environment actually sorted out this quote-unquote problem for us via seasonal eating. Like I mentioned, I used to believe that the more plants or veggies that I ate, the better. And this is simply not true. Just because some of something may be good doesn't mean that more is necessarily better. Exercise, amazing for you. Too much of it, not great. You'll run yourself into the ground. Water, crucial for survival. Too much of it, you can literally die, and people have. Sun exposure, so healthy. Too much of it and you burn. That's no bueno. So tying carnivore back in with oxalates, carnivore is essentially a zero oxalate diet because animal foods contain virtually no oxalates. And so for the first couple of weeks, my body was doing just fine without eating any oxalate-containing foods. But for some folks, when they reduce the amount of oxalate that they are eating too much and or too fast, their body goes, oh, sweet, now we can get rid of the oxalate that we've been busy storing in the body for years. Hence, oxalate dumping. So my body began to release the stored stuff into circulation, and as a result, my knee pain resurfaced. it's kind of tricky, right? Because for folks that experience oxalate dumping, they need to follow the Goldilocks approach, meaning not too hot, not too cold, but just right. I.e., they don't want to eat too much oxalate so that their body continues to store it, but they also don't want to eat too little oxalate because then their body dumps too much into circulation and they experience negative symptoms. It's truly a balance. For example, when I realized after 2-ish weeks that I was experiencing oxalate dumping because my symptoms all of a sudden got worse without actually eating any oxalates, it's the only thing that made sense. I then intentionally ate some higher oxalate foods in order to essentially tell my body to slow down the release. I went with yams, potatoes, and some sourdough bread, and within 24 hours, my knees were feeling better. So the key takeaway for me personally via this experiment is that closely monitoring how much oxalate I'm eating is the route to go. I don't want to consume too many because I'm not interested in storing more of them in my tissues and making my knee pain and health worse, big picture. But I also don't want to consume too few because that also flares things up, which in turn rules out a strict long-term carnivore diet as a therapeutic tool for me, at least right now. Having said that, I'm still having quite a few quote-unquote carnivore meals where I might eat something like steak and eggs. I may even have whole days where I'm again eating quote-unquote carnivore. Yesterday, in fact, was essentially that. Since I wrapped up this experiment, I'd say I've been about 80 to 90% carnivore. The vast majority of my calories are coming from animal foods. So just like someone may say that they're on a plant-based diet, I'd say I'm more so towards the animal-based end of the spectrum because that has me feel my best. I actually might even retest a strict carnivore diet at some point just to see if anything has changed. The body is so dynamic and things are shifting and moving all the time. Now, this was just my experience with a strict carnivore diet, and everyone is different. So the only way to truly find out how your body responds is just to give it a go if you're interested. This is why the name of my business is N1 Fitness. An N of 1 trial is just that. It's an experiment of one. And so we all really do have to play around and figure out what works best for us as individuals, given our health histories, current health status, goals, priorities, preferences, and the list goes on. That is why every single one of my clients' programs looks different. Also, for most people, the carnivore diet does seem to be a temporary therapeutic tool, meaning they do the diet for however long, let's say it's a month, 3 months, 6 months, a year, whatever is required to heal up their specific issue. And then they often begin to reintroduce different foods and watch how their body responds. Carnivore is essentially the ultimate elimination diet. It's sort of like a cleanse to a degree, and not a juice cleanse, an actual cleanse. One of the coolest, longer lasting benefits that I've noticed is that my digestion is better after doing this strict carnivore experiment for only 2.5 weeks. For example, I am tolerating specific foods better now after doing this than I was before doing it. Same foods, better digestive response. Pretty awesome. And this is almost certainly due to two primary things. One, the gut having a chance to heal. Think intestinal permeability, or more commonly known as leaky gut. And two, I probably had a bit of an overgrowth of bacteria in my small intestine. Think SIBO, or small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. Also, it's worth mentioning that this gut healing concept doesn't just apply to the carnivore diet, because plenty of people don't need to go to that extreme to see results. For example, I was just chatting with a client of mine who is not anywhere near carnivore. She eats plenty of animals and plenty of plants, but because we have improved her eating habits so much, her gut has had a chance to heal up to a degree, and so she's tolerating foods that she did not tolerate before. Pretty cool, right? Point being, a lot of folks don't need to go all the way to the carnivore end of the spectrum in order to see benefits. Tons of people can just either cut out or reduce the amount of ultra-processed foods, as well as specific foods that they aren't tolerating currently, replace them with more nutrient-dense foods, and experience massive improvements in their body composition and health. Now, what else can you take away from this episode and put into practice for yourself? 1, you probably aren't eating enough animal foods. I've worked with hundreds and hundreds of folks over the last 12 years, and I can count on one hand how many people were eating enough protein. 2, if you have excess weight and/or you're experiencing any sort of health issue, you're almost certainly eating too many ultra-processed foods. Do your best to peel that back, and interestingly enough, increasing your animal protein intake should support that because it's so nutritious and so satiating. 3, you may want to start being mindful of how your body and digestion specifically are being impacted by certain food choices. And I would recommend putting aside the idea of what you may think is a quote-unquote healthy food just for a week, let's say. For example, if you eat broccoli or cauliflower or insert whatever food you want here and you don't feel good, it's not a healthy food for you, at least for right now. And so you might want to experiment without it for a bit. You can always include it back in your diet again. It's not going anywhere. If you don't eat a veggie for a few days, you are not going to keel over and die. On the other hand, if you eat a big, juicy steak and you feel incredible, you've got lots of energy, your stomach feels great, you don't get that post-meal crash, honor that. You may also want to start being aware of your oxalate consumption because they are no joke. Some of the most oxalate-rich foods are, like I mentioned, spinach, almonds, and rhubarb, but also things like soy, certain nuts, seeds, and chocolate, specifically dark chocolate. Milk chocolate, funny enough, is a little lower in oxalates than the dark stuff. If you're keen to learn more about oxalates, I would recommend listening to episode number 171 titled Sweet Potatoes Made Me Sick, as well as episode 172 with Sally Norton, which I already mentioned. She also has a great book called Toxic Superfoods, definitely worth a read. I'm so glad that I did this carnivore diet experiment, and I'm not going to lie, it was challenging at times, and not because I was ever really hungry. In fact, I was having more trouble eating enough to maintain my weight versus eating too much because the diet is so satiating. And being in ketosis via such a low carb intake does an amazing job of mitigating hunger for a lot of people, and I'm one of those folks. The hard part was not eating other foods simply out of pure taste. I genuinely didn't want any treat foods. I just wanted fruit because I love it so much. But this is part of why I love doing challenges and experimenting. These experiences stretch me, and they're such an amazing tool for personal growth and just learning in general. So if you're thinking about giving the carnivore diet a go, or an animal-based diet, or any eating approach really, try it on like a shirt for 15 to 30 days and just see how you feel. It might just change your life, like improved nutrition has changed mine and so many of my clients' lives. And if it doesn't, you can always return to what you were doing before. No harm, no foul. If you want to apply for one-on-one nutritional coaching and or workout design with me, you can click the link in the description below or head over to n1fitness.com/coaching. If you're finding Simple helpful and you'd like to, feel free to leave the pod a review on your favorite podcast platform. And you can follow me on Instagram at N1Fitness, on TikTok at TheN1Fitness, and on YouTube at MarcusSadu/N1Fitness. If you want to stay up to date on the newest episode releases, you can hit the subscribe button. Thanks for tuning in. I hope that you found this info interesting and useful, and I will catch you on the next one. See ya.